The ancient stone walls of Chillingham Castle seemed to pulse with a dark, unsettling energy. Known for centuries as one of the most haunted places in England, the castle carried a grim history of torture, treachery, and restless spirits. Visitors spoke of strange sights and eerie sounds, but two spirits in particular were known to terrify all who entered. The Blue Boy, a young spirit whose wails echoed through the halls at midnight, and the infamous Headless Knight, who was said to roam the dungeons in search of revenge. One cold winter evening, a group of thrill-seekers decided to test the castle's haunted reputation. Armed with flashlights and a spirit box, they made their way through the labyrinthine halls, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. As they ventured deeper, a feeling of dread crept over them, as if they were trespassing on forbidden ground. Their guide, an older man with deep-set eyes, began recounting the story of the Blue Boy. They say he was a young boy bricked alive into the castle walls centuries ago, he explained. Some say he was a servant who saw something he shouldn't have, a terrible secret that sealed his fate. At midnight, he lets out a piercing scream, and sometimes, if you're brave enough to enter the pink room, you'll see a flash of blue light in the darkness. One of the group members laughed nervously. Sounds like a ghost story to scare tourists, but as they entered the pink room, the air turned icy, and a thick, unnatural silence fell over them. The spirit box crackled to life, static filling the room. Suddenly, a faint voice came through, as if from a great distance. "Help me," it whispered. Everyone froze. The laughter faded from their faces as they stared at one another, their skin prickling with fear. A piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing through the castle's stone corridors. It was the unmistakable cry of a young boy, filled with terror and despair. The sound reverberated off the walls, growing louder, until it seemed to come from every direction. Panicking, one of the visitors shone his flashlight around the room, illuminating a faint blue glow near one of the walls. The shape of a small handprint, glowing blue, appeared on the cold stone surface, slowly fading as they watched in horror. Then, from the far side of the room, a shadow moved, a tall, dark figure with no head, dressed in ancient armor. The Headless Knight. The figure glided toward them, his heavy footsteps echoing ominously, though his headless form made no sound. The guide backed away, his face pale. "Run," he whispered, his voice shaking. The group fled, racing down the winding corridors, but the Headless Knight's footsteps followed, slow and steady, echoing in the darkness. They burst into the dungeon, hoping to find an exit, but the air grew colder, and they could hear the faint clanking of chains. The walls seemed to close in, the smell of damp stone and iron thick in the air. Suddenly, one of them screamed as they saw a pair of spectral hands reaching out from a cell, shackled with heavy, rusted chains. The ghostly figure within moaned in agony, his tortured soul unable to escape the horrors he had endured in life. Panicking, the group stumbled through the dungeon, the spirit box hissing and crackling wildly. "You can't leave," a voice rasped through the static. Just as they thought they were cornered, the guide pushed open a hidden door, leading them back into the courtyard. They stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping, relieved to be free from the suffocating presence of the castle's tortured spirits. As they caught their breath, one of them glanced back at the looming shadow of Chillingham Castle. In one of the highest windows, a faint blue glow appeared, a small boy, staring down at them with hollow, pleading eyes. And beside him, the silhouette of a knight, headless and still, his form watching with silent fury. The visitors left, but the memory of that night stayed with them, haunting their dreams and leaving them forever changed. For in Chillingham Castle, the spirits did not rest, bound eternally by the secrets and sins of the past. And anyone who dared to return knew that the Blue Boy and the Headless Knight would be waiting, eager to share the darkness that had claimed them so long ago. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The visitors hurried through the night, the shadow of Chillingham Castle looming large behind them. But as they made their way down the old, cobbled path leading away from the fortress, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps began to echo again, footsteps that didn't belong to any of them. Turning, They saw a dark figure standing just beyond the castle gates, shrouded in mist. The Headless Knight, his outline barely visible against the darkened stone walls. His form seemed to sway, his armor clanking with a chilling rhythm, as if he were trapped between worlds, following them into the night. Their guide, now visibly shaken, urged them forward. "Keep walking," he whispered. "Don't look back. Spirits like him, they follow those who disturb their rest." The group moved faster, but an unnatural cold settled around them, and a low, whispering voice drifted through the air, faint yet piercing. "You can't leave, you're bound, just like us." One of the visitors stumbled, glancing back. To his horror, he saw the faint blue glow of the blue boy's figure, standing in a nearby window, watching them leave with hollow, desperate eyes. His pale hand lifted, as if beckoning them to return, a silent plea etched onto his ghostly face. The visitor shuddered, feeling a strange pull, a compulsion to step back toward the castle. His mind filled with flashes of another time, ancient walls and dark corridors, screams and chains, and a feeling of being trapped, unable to escape. "We have to go back," he murmured, his voice almost trance-like. The others pulled him along, shaking him free from the spell. "No," the guide insisted, his voice a low warning. "That's how they lure you. If you return, you become part of the castle's curse. Once you've seen them, they'll follow until they take what they want." But even as they quickened their pace, the cold only grew more intense, as if the chill of the castle itself had latched onto them. Shadows danced along the path, and the whispering voices grew louder, overlapping, pleading, accusing. "Secrets, secrets bound in stone," one voice murmured, barely a whisper, before it faded. They finally reached the edge of the woods, where the faint glimmer of morning was beginning to break. But as they stepped onto the main road, the last visitor in line felt a hand cold, spectral, and as heavy as iron close around his wrist. He froze, his heart pounding as he looked down, seeing only the faint outline of a gauntlet hand gripping him tightly. He tried to pull free, but the hold was strong, immovable. A chilling whisper floated past his ear, almost as if it was within his own mind. Secrets kept in blood, bound to stone. Before he could scream, the grip loosened, and he stumbled forward, collapsing onto the road. His friends helped him up, but he could barely speak, his voice stolen by the ghostly touch. As they hurried away, one final glance back revealed the shadows retreating into the castle, but the faint blue glow lingered in the highest window. The blue boy's sad eyes followed them, a silent promise that Chillingham's spirits were far from finished with those who had dared to disturb their restless slumber. And as the morning light finally broke through, the group couldn't shake the feeling that they'd left a part of themselves behind in Chillingham Castle, perhaps bound forever to its ancient, haunted stones. The group stumbled down the road, shaken but determined to put as much distance as possible between them and Chillingham Castle. Yet, even as they walked, they couldn't escape the feeling that something was following. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind them, only to fall silent whenever they stopped to listen. One of them, Sarah, felt a weight settle in her chest, a deep sense of sorrow that grew heavier with each step. Images flickered in her mind, as if memories from another life, a dim corridor, stone walls soaked in darkness, and a single room where the air was thick with desperation and pain. She could see the blue boy's terrified eyes, his mouth open in a silent scream as he was bricked into the wall. She clutched her head, her heart pounding, as if somehow his memories had latched onto her. "Are you okay?" one of her friends asked, but she could barely hear them. All she could focus on was a voice in her mind, faint but insistent. "Set me free, find the stone." They continued down the road, but the whispers persisted, growing louder as they reached the edge of the forest. Suddenly, Sarah stopped in her tracks, her eyes glazed over. "We can't leave yet," she said, her voice low and distant. The others looked at her, alarmed. "What are you talking about?" one of them asked. "We need to keep moving." But Sarah shook her head slowly. He's calling to me," she murmured. "He wants me to find something. A stone, some kind of marker in the castle." I can see it, it's hidden under the floor in the pink room. The group exchanged uneasy glances. The pink room was where they'd first encountered the blue boy's ghost, where his haunting wails had echoed through the walls. The thought of returning there filled them with dread. But they couldn't deny that Sarah seemed to be under some kind of spell, her gaze unfocused, as though she were seeing something they couldn't. "We're not going back in there," the guide said firmly. "That castle, whatever haunts it, it doesn't let go once it gets a hold of you." But Sarah's hand tightened around the key she'd kept from her time in the pink room, her fingers trembling as she felt an unnatural cold seeping into her skin. "It's the only way," she whispered. "If we don't find the stone, his spirit will never rest." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah turned back toward the castle, her steps slow and steady, as if she were being pulled by an invisible force. The others reluctantly followed, their fear giving way to a strange sense of inevitability, as if they were meant to uncover whatever secrets Chillingham held. They entered the castle once more, and the familiar chill settled over them. Shadows seemed to ripple along the walls, moving with unnatural fluidity. The castle seemed to be waiting, watching. As they stepped into the pink room, the air grew dense, and a low hum filled the space. Sarah moved to the center of the room, kneeling down as if guided by unseen hands. Her fingers traced a faint outline on the floor, a small stone that looked out of place among the larger slabs. She pressed on it, and the stone shifted slightly, revealing a hollow beneath it. Inside was a small, ancient relic, a silver pendant etched with symbols that none of them recognized. Sarah's fingers trembled as she lifted it, feeling a surge of cold rush through her, as though the pendant were alive with an ancient energy. But as soon as she touched it, a deafening scream filled the room. The blue boy's apparition materialized, his form flickering in and out of view, his face a mask of terror. His eyes locked onto Sarah, and she could feel his fear, his pain, everything he had endured in his final moments. A heavy, ghostly hand fell onto her shoulder. She turned slowly, dread filling her heart, and saw the towering figure of the Headless Knight, his presence suffocating, his sword drawn. The knight's hand reached toward the pendant, his hollow armor echoing with the faint whispers of other souls. Sarah's grip tightened around the relic, her eyes wide with horror, as she felt a pull toward the shadows, as if her very soul were being drawn into the castle's dark depths. The last thing she heard was the blue boy's voice, pleading in her mind, "Only one of us can leave." The room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the despair of countless souls. Sarah's heart raced as she clutched the pendant, feeling its cold, unyielding metal press into her skin. The Headless Knight's figure loomed closer, his armor creaking, his hands still outstretched. Though he had no face, no eyes, she could feel his gaze fixed on her, relentless, unyielding. "Give it back," the blue boy's voice whispered in her mind, filled with longing and fear. Her friends called her name, their voices muffled as if they were speaking from far away, trapped behind some invisible barrier. One of them tried to reach her, but the floorboards between them shifted, creating a chasm that seemed to widen with every step she took toward the figure of the knight. The knight's hand hovered above the pendant, and as Sarah looked into the hollow space where his eyes should be, a flood of visions struck her, images of the knight in life, a soldier betrayed and abandoned, his spirit bound to the castle as punishment for a crime he had never committed. In his mind, he was trapped, endlessly seeking revenge on those who had wronged him, forever chained to Chillingham's cursed walls. With each second, she felt his anger, his despair merging with her own, threatening to consume her. But then, the blue boy's face appeared beside her, his small, ethereal hand reaching out to touch hers. "Help me, please," his voice echoed, fragile and pleading. "If he takes the pendant, he'll never let me go. I'll be here forever." Sarah's grip tightened on the pendant, and she felt the pendant grow warm, a faint glow emanating from its surface. The knight recoiled, his shadow retreating, but he didn't vanish. Instead, he grew larger, his form swelling until it cast a long, dark shadow over the room. His voice, a low, rumbling growl, echoed through the castle. "I was promised my freedom." The walls shook, dust raining down from the ceiling as the ghostly figures of other spirits began to appear around them, spectral forms of prisoners and soldiers, all bound to the castle's legacy of blood and betrayal. One of Sarah's friends, her face pale with fear, shouted, "Sarah, drop it. We don't know what it wants, what it'll do." But Sarah couldn't let go. She felt the weight of the pendant, of the blue boy's spirit, of the knight's curse, all entangled in a fate that had been sealed centuries ago. Somehow, she knew the pendant held a way to break the cycle, to release them all if only she could figure out how. The knight's shadow drew closer, enveloping her in darkness. She could barely see her friends now, their voices distant. The castle itself seemed alive, its stones whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. And in her hand, the pendant pulsed with an ancient energy, guiding her toward a decision that would change everything. "Only one of us can leave," the boy's voice echoed once more, filled with fear and finality. In that moment, Sarah knew that whatever choice she made, it would come at a cost, one she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. The darkness around Sarah grew thick, almost tangible, pressing down on her like a weight. The Headless Knight loomed, his armored hand hovering just above her, the cold radiating from him so intense that her breath came in sharp, painful gasps. The walls seemed to pulse with life, whispering secrets and voices that blended together, telling tales of betrayal, anger, and loss. She looked down at the blue boy's ghostly face, his eyes wide and desperate. His hand reached for hers, and as his cold fingers met her own, a shock ran through her, filling her with images of his past, of a small, terrified boy hidden away, bricked into the walls as punishment for secrets he should never have known. "Help me," he whispered again, his voice barely a breath. The pendant grew heavier in her hand, its glow intensifying, casting eerie shadows across the room. She could feel the Headless Knight's fury pressing against her, and in her mind, she heard him speak an old, anguished voice, echoing from the depths of his torment. "They took everything," he said, his voice like the grinding of stone. "They sealed me in darkness, and they will pay." The blue boy's grip on her hand tightened, his spirit flickering, growing dimmer. "I don't want to be here forever," he pleaded, his voice choked with fear. "Please, don't let him take me." Trembling, Sarah looked between the two spirits, feeling the crushing weight of their demands. If she gave the pendant to the knight, he would be released from his curse, but at a price. The boy's spirit would remain trapped within Chillingham's haunted walls, forever bound to the pain that had claimed his young life. And yet, if she kept the pendant, there was no guarantee they'd be safe. The knight's wrath would follow them, his spirit doomed to haunt anyone who crossed his path, until he found peace or took revenge. A voice, deep and unsettling, echoed through her mind, stirring something she couldn't name. "Choose," it whispered, ancient and relentless. "One life must remain here, bound to the castle's curse. Only then can the other be free." Her friends, still trapped on the other side of the shifting floorboards, called out to her, their voices urgent, but she barely heard them. All she could hear was the steady hum of the pendant, and the voices of the two spirits, one filled with sorrow, the other with a rage that had been waiting centuries to be unleashed. She raised the pendant, its glow casting flickering blue light across the stone walls. The Headless Knight stepped forward, his hand reaching for the relic, while the blue boy shrank back, his form dimming as he watched in silent dread. "Sarah!" one of her friends shouted, desperate to break through her trance. "Don't let him take it." But she felt as if she were no longer in control. The pendant pulsed with a force beyond her, tugging her toward a choice she couldn't undo, binding her to a fate that felt as ancient as the castle itself. "Only one can leave," the voices whispered in unison, blending into a single, haunting command. With a deep breath, Sarah held the pendant tightly, feeling its pull as the choice solidified in her mind. She looked at the blue boy, his eyes pleading, and whispered, "You deserve peace." In a swift motion, she raised the pendant toward the Headless Knight, whose shadowy figure recoiled as a blinding blue light engulfed the room. The knight's form wavered, then dissolved, his fury dissipating in the light. The ghostly faces around them faded, their restless spirits finally freed. The blue boy's form grew clearer, a gentle smile crossing his face as he whispered, "Thank you." He faded into the light, his spirit at last released from Chillingham's walls. As the light dimmed, Sarah found herself alone with her friends, the castle's ominous presence now eerily calm. They hurried out, glancing back at the silent, looming structure one last time. In the highest window, no figure appeared, only the quiet stillness of a castle finally at peace. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.